Thank you for joining us this afternoon. The topic of this afternoon's panel is Despair and Hope, Politics, Religion, and Community in a Changing World. And while the changing world certainly impacts politics, religion, and community, the need and the challenge and the difficulty in navigating between despair and hope is probably an eternal one, not affected by our changing world. Is despair the posture of realism, while hope is the posture of idealism? Is the difference between hope and despair tied in with human agency, whether or not we have the ability to change the situation? Is hope a theological statement, and if so, what exactly is that statement? What is it saying? Does having a long view of history make us more hopeful or less hopeful? These are some of the questions that will frame our discussion this afternoon. And before introducing our distinguished panelists, I want to briefly ground the notions of despair and hope in the context of Tisha B'Av. The poles of despair and hope are built into the very fabric of this day. Eicha Rabbah and other sources tell us that the Messiah will be born on this very day that marks our national calamity, that the seeds of redemption are already planted in the midst of our destruction. Zechariah, in his prophecy, sees that at the end of time, days like Tisha B'Av will become days of joy. L'sason, u'lesimcha, u'lemoadim tovim. And perhaps one of the richest texts that links Tisha B'Av with the polarity between despair and hope is found at the end of Masechet Makot, this well-known passage, and I understand some of you studied this earlier this morning with Rabbi Weitzman, but I think it's worth revisiting in this context. Tells us at the end of Makot, once Rabban Gamliel, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Yoshua, and Rabbi Akiva were walking along the road in the Roman Empire. They were 120 miles from Rome, in a city now called Putuoli, and they could hear people rejoicing in Rome. And the sages began weeping, and Rabbi Akiva began laughing. And they said to him, Rabbi Akiva, why are you laughing? And he said, why are you weeping? They said to him, those who bow to false gods and burn incense to idols, they dwell in security and tranquility. And for us, God's house, the footstool of God, is burned by fire. How could we not weep? And Rabbi Akiva says, that's why I'm laughing. If those who violate God's will are rewarded in such a way, how much more so at some future point will all of us? And then this Agadah continues in a similar kind of mode. On another occasion, they were ascending to Mount Scopus. They were ascending to Jerusalem, and when they stopped at Mount Scopus, they saw a fox emerging from the site of the Kodesh Kodashim, the Holy of Holies. And they began weeping, and Rabbi Akiva was laughing. And they said to him, why are you laughing? And he said, why are you weeping? And they said, it says in Bamidbar, V'hazar hakarev yumat, that the non-priest who approaches this holy place should die. And now there's a fox alive and well crawling around this spot. Rabbi Akiva says, well, the source of hope is found in two prophecies, one from the first temple and one from the second temple. From the first temple, Uriah in Sefer Yeshayahu says, Lechem biglalchem Tzion sadeh techaresh, that therefore because of you, Zion shall be plowed as a field. But, says Rabbi Akiva, if that was prophesied in the days of the first temple, then in the days of the second temple, Zechariah said, Od yeshvu zekenim uzkenot birchavot Yerushalayim. That old and young, that old men and old women will once again sit securely in the streets of Jerusalem. We're going to try to ground these poles of despair and hope in very particular examples, but we'll challenge our panelists as we proceed to draw from their specific examples something more general about the state of despair or hope with regard to religion, community, and politics. I'm so pleased that we're joined by three dear colleagues. Nechama Goldman Barish teaches rabbinic literature, women and Judaism, medical ethics, prophets, and Bible at Pardes. She studied for 3 years in Matan's Advanced Talmud Institute and holds a master's degree in Talmud from Bar Ilan University. She's also a graduate of Nishmat's Yoetzet Halacha program, and in addition to Pardes, she teaches at a variety of other Israeli institutions. Rabbi David Levin-Kruss, after teaching at Pardes for 16 years, is now the Director of Jewish Education for Europe for the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. We're still proud to have David as an adjunct faculty member. Before studying yeshiva and getting smicha, David himself was a student at Pardes. Originally from South Africa, David served as a community director and family educator in England. David's trained as a life coach and has developed a new methodology of using Jewish texts to achieve personal breakthroughs. And Rabbi Dr. Daniel Roth is the director of our Pardes Center for Judaism and Conflict Resolution. He holds a PhD from Bar Ilan University's Program for Conflict Resolution, Management, and Negotiation. He has been teaching advanced rabbinics, Bible, conflict resolution, and other subjects at Pardes for more than 15 years. Daniel is also a lecturer at Bar Ilan's Program for Conflict Resolution. So I want to begin by asking each of you, through a different lens, Daniel through the lens of politics, Nechama through the lens of religious life, and David through the lens of Jewish community building. For each of you to say a bit about what fills you with concern and despair, and what in the midst of this despair enables you, at least at times, to be a bit like Rabbi Akiva in the Agadah that we just read. What enables you to have a sense of hope in the fields in which you work? We're going to try to have this discussion here at the table. So if you have to adjust your seats slightly to see our panelists, we encourage you to do so.
Possible. So, do you move the left shirt?
Or you want to start?
We're going to begin with Nechama.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm going to speak about religion, but most particularly about women in religion. That's something that I think I well represent for the last 30 years in the studying and the teaching that I've been doing. I'll just point out a small thing to talk a little bit about the struggle I have. When Leon introduced us, it was easy for the men to each have a title, Rabbi and Rabbi Doctor, but I don't have an obvious title. I don't have a doctorate, and I've deliberately not gone and been ordained. I've studied many of the subject material that's necessary for ordination, but I've chosen for reasons maybe I'll talk about to not get smicha, and so I end up. It's a little funny. I mean, I've been learning for probably 30 years, learning halacha and learning Talmud. And so that's one of those moments where you feel the inequality of being an Orthodox woman in a halachic system. I will say that, I'll touch a little bit on my journey, but one of the revolutions has really been my ability to be a full member and participant in a rabbinic organization called Beit Hillel, this topic of what to call learned women was very much discussed, what was decided was to use the title of Rabbanit. And so often when I speak, I'm introduced as Rabbanit, which was traditionally a rabbi's wife, but by kind of reappropriating the title to represent women who have reached a certain level of study and knowledge and leadership in the community, it created a non-political title. And I think being part of that decision very much represents who I am and what I'm trying to do, trying to create a more moderate dialogue around what is really an extremely controversial and red herring topic, in the sense that I don't think anything quite is shaking up the system in the same way that women's role in Orthodox Judaism is. And over the course of the few minutes I have to talk, I'll reflect on that. But first I really want to take you to last night. Last night, as a representative of Beit Hillel, I went out to Beit HaKerem to participate in a dialogue group. Now, there were dialogue groups all over Jerusalem in memory of Shira Banki. Last year, I led a dialogue group in Kikar Tzion in English on the topic of LGBT discourse and the religious and non-religious communities. And this year, they asked me to go to Beit HaKerem, which is a very Israeli community and a fairly secular community. And the difference between Kikar Tzion and Beit HaKerem is that Beit HaKerem was really a neighborhood dialogue group. Kikar Tzion, Zion Square, really attracts anyone who's in town at the time. Young and old, tourists, English speakers, French, German, meaning really a very diverse group. And so this was really going into almost a little box. Like there was not a lot of diversity, not in age and not in background. But I was honored to sit together with Alice Shelby, Professor Alice Shelby. I see from nods, many of you have heard of her, and Anat Hoffman. And together we were talking about Jerusalem and the religious struggle for who has kind of dominance over what goes on in Jerusalem. And in addition to being a tremendous honor to be in a group with them, it wasn't really a panel, it was a discussion. Really, I think the evening represented, again, the vacillations between hope and despair, with Anat Hoffman representing Women of the Wall and the struggle they've had to kind of carve out a place for themselves in a space so dear and so sacred to thousands of years of history and peoplehood, and this fight to kind of break the monopoly of the ultra-Orthodox, of the Haredim, on that space. You have Alice Shelby, who really represents she's already 91, and may she live to 120, still extremely sharp, very personable, talking about the many years of conversation around women's rights. She no longer goes to the Kotel because for her that went from 1967, where men and women stood side by side immediately in the aftermath of the liberation, and she says, she went without her shawl and was next to ultra-Orthodox men, and everyone was praying together, to really a synagogue prayer space, which is gendered, men and women separate with the mechitza. She no longer goes there, but really the fight she's had, both with Israeli and Palestinian women, creating conversations and dialogue for the rights of women, divorce of women, and so she really represents, as she enters her twilight years, decades of really trying to again, move between hope and despair, but constantly moving forward to affect change. As the winner of an Israel Prize, obviously she's recognized for affecting a lot of change. And so, throughout the hour and a half in which we sat there, really, it was very easy to break into despair. I'll also mention they had invited Haredim, and the moderator of the group has a lot of Haredi colleagues. I believe he works in the municipality. And one by one they refused to come, and it ended up creating a space where it was very easy to attack Haredim, to do the other, to do the Haredi bashing, because everyone has a story. And really, a number of the people in the group were trying very hard to stay away from that. This is Tisha B'Av. We need to find the common denominator between us. We need to find what we have in common, not always look at the other. And one of the things I said, and I'll continue from there, is that it's okay to acknowledge the moments of intense rupture in society, to acknowledge even the borderline and, dare I say, hatred we sometimes feel for one another. But once we acknowledge and are mindful of that, it doesn't mean it contradicts our ability or the necessity to really talk to one another and continue to build. So we can go from terrible interactions at the Kotel and nonetheless sit down together and try to stop calling the people on the other side of the table other. And it's a very delicate balance, and I think Tisha B'Av is a very good place to reflect on that, both acknowledging the rupture and moving towards the reconciliation. Meaning we need to do that simultaneously, because I would never ask Anat Hoffman to really step down from the fight she's fighting, or some of the fights that I fight, or Alice Shelby, because it's in the fight, and it's in the extreme rhetoric, and sometimes the extreme protest that we show that change comes. But at the same time, constantly remembering that we're dealing with, people created in the image of God like ourselves, and hopefully, again, moving backwards and forwards between rupture, reconciliation, rupture, reconciliation. So I wanted to share that as an opening, because I think that religious conversation, and who is a Jew, and who is religious, and what does religion look like, there's a lot of despair in that conversation. And we could really sink into despair and sit on the floor and feel that we are never going to unite around any particular topic. There's too much rupture. But I would like to bring us to a place where we can be hopeful that nonetheless we do move forward, even as we move backward and forward and backward. So let me talk a little bit about women in Judaism, because as I said, I really think that is what's shaking up halachic Judaism, or religious discourse right now in Orthodoxy. And part of that is because Judaism for 2,000 years, 2,000 plus years, has been very binary, male and female. Meaning, I want to give a shout out to Rabbinic Judaism, because I think 2,000 years ago they took great pains to value women and to create a very strong space for Jewish women. It wasn't equality, and it wasn't feminism, but at the same time, I think even the matrilineal principle, which causes so many problems today in other denominations, really allowed the womb to equal the circumcision. Now that's not a small thing. I mean, that means women are fundamentally necessary for the survivability and sustainability of the Jewish people. And if the circumcised Jewish male is really the one leading the services and learning the Torah, nonetheless, he can't do anything without the womb of the Jewish woman. And I think that was a brilliant understanding that without creating some sort of equally significant place for women, then everyone was going to lose. And so from that space, really talking a lot about women, the wife, the mother, being the focal point of the home. Again, for 2,000 years, that was a significant advance over other societies and cultures, really elevating the Jewish wife. In addition, women's right to have sexual pleasure. For those who know me and have heard me, I'm a sexuality educator, counselor. I do a lot of talking on Judaism and sexuality in different communities. And it astonishes me over and over again that women had the right to sexual pleasure, men had the duty to give women sexual pleasure. What happened afterwards is another conversation, but that insight, that recognition that women were independent and had similar needs as men is not to be undervalued. But women were exempted from many things. They were not prohibited from engaging in those things. And so, while that may sound very nuanced, it's extremely important. Meaning, we could have been prohibited from doing all sorts of mitzvot, right? The positive time-down mitzvot we were exempted from, but exemption doesn't mean prohibition, and it doesn't mean exclusion. And so, I try to look at that when I teach the 2,000 years of Jewish texts, to really acknowledge and pay attention to the conversation that unfolded, because on one hand, very, very binary, male and female, different roles, different spaces in Jewish society. And that's led us to where we are today with the pushing for more and more equality. On the other hand, I have to acknowledge that there was a lot of recognition of the need to create meaningful Jewish lives for women wherever they were. Okay, so what has given me a lot of hope? Well, really, the revolution of women's education. I mean, that's where it begins, and that's where it continues, and that's where it's going. If Sarah Schneer in the late 1800s suddenly recognized that we were hemorrhaging women because the women were going to the universities or to the gymnasium and they were becoming secularly educated and leaving Jewish identity and Jewish connection, intermarrying and assimilating, she realized that the only way to stem that flood was to start educating women in Jewish text. And really, we get from there to the Maharat in 100 years, and that's not a lot of time if we think about Jewish history. And really, from the Beit Yaakov movement, it really unfolded to Yoatzot and Maharats and Toanot, women working in the rabbinic courts, women consulting with rabbinic authorities, or rabbinic authorities actually consulting with women on matters having to do with halacha in women. And I think that there's no way to really undo that, that women are constantly going forward and being educated, and as a result taking more central places in the community. And then of course it leads to, well, can they be rabbis? Can they be judges? Those questions are being asked. They can be rabbis. They are rabbis. Meaning that battle was lost even as the OU wrote their 17 or 19 paper. It was a position paper that said very little, except that this is not tradition. It's true, it's not tradition. And it's true that I don't want to lose the men to gain the women. And it's true that I don't want to delegitimize or disrespect men to gain the women. That's very important. On the other hand, we're gaining the women. The women are already there, and the question is, how are we going to move forward from that point on? I didn't really talk, I think I mentioned despair because I mentioned a lot of disagreement, and that always leads to despair. I would say probably in my last minute, the place that I most despair is divorce and agunot. And all I can say is every one of us has to live with we have to push back against that. That's a perversion of what the Torah stands for and the values and the morality that Judaism stands for. And I think if I have despair, it's in that space. And yet my hope comes from Rachel Levmore, who created the halachic prenuptial agreement. And my hope comes from rabbis who are pushing, or judges who are pushing for innovative halachic approaches to try to solve that problem. So I vacillate as well between hope and despair in that space as well. And all I can say is God created man and woman together as one, and I think we have to constantly look at, B'Tselem Elokim bara otam, we're all created in Tselem Elokim, and I think when we have conversations, we need to bring that first and foremost to the table.
As you said your last minute about one of the heaviest topics about Gunot, you struck an emotional chord within me that brought me back over 20 years ago, a lot more than that, when I was a young yeshiva student, 18 years old, thinking I could solve the world's problems, and I said to myself, I'm going to stay in yeshiva for about 50 years, forbid everything, say no to everything, and then one day somehow try to solve the Gunot problem. It is not the direction I went in terms of my own field, but it's something that's so painful to know how to address. So I was tasked as relating to the topic of politics, and in particular civil discourse or uncivil discourse, as a place of despair, because I direct our center here for Judaism and conflict resolution. But before I touch upon that, I couldn't help but not share some deep feelings of despair in the wake of last week's events, in particular around the Temple Mount. It's interesting how, again, we're on Tisha B'Av and we're talking about the most sacred space and its destruction. You mentioned the tensions on the Kotel, about the Mechitza. I'm thinking about the other Mechitza between the Islamic-Jewish divide. In addition to my role at Pardes, I also teach, as Leon mentioned, about Islam and Judaism and peace building in Bar Ilan University. I spend a lot of my time working with organizations, looking at texts. And it's events like last week that just knock the air out of me, and it feel like, all the cynics, my friends who say, now you're going to come around and you'll finally see religion is only a source of conflict. It's hard, and in particular, the most difficult moment for me last week of real despair was the video that went viral through Israeli news and social media of the thousands and thousands of Israeli Arabs singing and dancing at Fathem at the funeral of the 3 terrorists. And that really, really hurt. Because then I couldn't just justify it was a few people, but it was really thousands out in the road. And in my moment of despair, I reached out and messaged a dear friend who's a professor of conflict resolution in Washington. And I said to him, what do you think about Fathem? He said, I haven't seen the video. So I said, I'll send it to you. I sent it to him. He said, it's terrible. he's much more connected, I should note, with the Muslim community at large, and Palestinians in particular. And he said, it's a horrible, terrible thing. He says, I just want to let you know, and I'm not making moral equivalency, I just want to let you know what was going around on Facebook and the news last week in the Palestinian social media, which was a video of thousands of yeshiva students in Hebron singing and dancing over, taking over a Palestinian home. I'm not making the equivalency, but what was interesting for me was how the two of us were living in different realities. I was, totally immersed in the news and the videos that I'm consuming and that are totally bringing me despair. He's watching something totally different. And we would have had no idea of even what our own communities are experiencing if we had not had that little exchange. Which brings me to the primary area of despair that I'm supposed to relate to. Thank you. It starts right now, right? 10 minutes? Because I'm now talking about politics. So yes, like many, I have become addicted to the reality show of news, especially around the political news in America. And as somebody who, as we run programs for middle schools here at Pardes and synagogues where we're training in how to use Jewish text and conflict resolution skills, the last year has been a very significant test. We hear reports of schools, Jewish day schools, where kids are fighting in the hallways over red-blue divides, where congregations are threatened to fall apart. And I think to myself, that's actually not what concerns me. What concerns me are the synagogues and schools and campuses where there is intention, where actually they're only in safe blue communities or safe red communities because they have no interaction with people that are of a difference of opinion. And that they can feel very snug and very comfortable, whether it be around their own Shabbos table or their own virtual Shabbos table of Facebook, where they're constantly hearing the echo of their own, views and ideologies and feeling very comfortable and feeling very right. That's what really concerns me. Just to share one story, I think it was the last Shabbat of the year program, the Pardes year program this past year. I had two wonderful students who I've become very close with. They came over to my house for Shabbat. They really wanted to have a chance to spend some time together. I said, just a heads up, we have family, my in-laws are in town. I didn't say anything more. It was probably very shortly after Motzi that the students started reflecting upon their year, and they started saying something that might have been understood as being slightly anti-Trump. Anyway, 3 hours later, my father-in-law, who is an absolute, admirer of the president and the Israeli prime minister, it got very interesting. We did take the knives off the Shabbos table as of the time. And what was ironic is that I told that we actually practice this in our Pardes class as we talk about what we practice, like how do you engage in difficult conversations around the Shabbat table, and there it was, like in live, and they were watching me lose my cool as well. But I walked away as we kind of process the situation of like, thank God these students had the opportunity to sit with somebody of a different generation who had a different life experience, who had a totally different way of looking at the world. And for my father-in-law, who I love dearly, okay, but he doesn't often have an opportunity to sit with two young, intellectual, liberal Jews, passionate about their Judaism, passionate about their politics, and for them to be engaging in that difficult but yet constructive learning conversation. And that brings me to the place of hope. This brings me to the place of hope. The very last halacha of Hilchot Tisha B'Av, since Hilchot Gadol, since the Gaonic time period, has been this statement of Atid Lavo, Atid HaKadosh Baruch Hu La'avchan L'Sasom L'Simcha She'emar V'Hafachti Avlam L'Simcha. That one day in the future God will take Tisha B'Av and the many other fast days that are on our calendar and turn them into being days of rejoicing and happiness. I have never understood that to be just a hope, an aspiration, a prayer, but I saw it always as being a charge and a commandment of what can we do to learn the lessons of these fast days and turn them into days of rejoicing and celebration. So about 21 years ago, the first Tisha B'Av after the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, I took this very seriously. At the time I was in the army. I also had worked very hard in having strong relations in the Haredi world. and there was a lot of tension going on around the Bar Ilan Road. If anyone can remember back then, about closing it on Shabbat. And we drew these beautiful posters of land of Israel kind of split, cracked down the middle, with the Bar Ilan Road going down, and terrible slogans that were being said by the Tel Aviv world against the Jerusalem world, and back and forth. And I got my friends from different identity groups like, let's go out and let's do some social action. We'll turn Tisha B'Av into a day of healthy machloket and healthy disagreement, and we hung them up. Anyway, I ended up in the police station. Apparently you need a permit to put up posters around this. They're like, we love what you're doing, but not that way. I am deeply grateful to Pardes that they helped me get that permit to put up posters, but not around the 9th of Av. But we took another one of the fast days that are mentioned in Hilchot Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Adar, okay? Tisha B'Adar, which gets much less press than the 9th of Av, okay? But it was the day that Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai were the model of how to do all of this stuff. You mentioned Beit Hillel, right? But we're supposed to be the model of how do we engage in healthy disagreement, understanding perspectives, preserving good relationships. On that day, they lost it. And according to the tradition, some 3,000 students were killed in the Beit Midrash over how to relating to others and how to make peace or war with Rome. So we took that day as saying, let's use it as a wake-up call. The same way we're using Tisha B'Av right now. How can we strengthen our culture of disagreement, of understanding one another? And I'll share just two particular points, and then I'll wrap up in relation to the areas of despair. First, regarding Jewish-Muslim relations in this country. We had started the 9 Adar project 4 or 5 years ago. It was 3 years now since the kidnapping of the 3 boys, and then the subsequent murder of the Palestinian boy. At that moment, we felt we could no longer promote a Jewish holiday or a Jewish week of awareness around constructive conflict and machloket, which is only internally Jewish. And we turned to our partners, Mosaic, just across the street, Rabbi Malkior and their team that do both interreligious and mediation centers around the country. We said we need to team up and include Awareness Week around conflict resolution that will touch the hearts not only within the Jewish community here, but also amongst the interfaith world, the interfaith Muslim community. And it was a point of again, turning despair back into hope, of saying, let's gather different interfaith organizations around the country. How can they also help to promote a culture of healthy disagreement, as well as using our Jewish text? So that was one response that brings me hope. And on the civil discourse issue, how do we push back against what's happening in the culture, the erosion of democratic values of disagreement? And I feel like the answer is sitting in this room, like literally sitting in this room, because this is a Beit Midrash. And one of the campaigns we're hoping to do through this year's 9 Adar that we didn't have out on time for your seats, but I will tell it to you anyway, is a picture of what we're doing right now, but a question of, can we read the news the way we read our text? Because we know how to read text. We know how to sit in chavruta with somebody very often in this Beit Midrash from a very different worldview, different background. We know how to read the different commentaries carefully, noticing all the nuances, engaging it in a way of derech eretz, and then come out having learning from our chavruta, learning from the different commentaries. We know how to do that. It's a lens of Jewish wisdom that has kept us surviving for thousands of years. How can we apply that to the major identity conflicts posing not only the Jewish world, but the democratic world today? That, I think, is a challenge, and that, I think, is part of the despair that charges us to do that as a place of bringing about more hope.
If somebody were to ask me, what is the most hopeful place in the Jewish world, geographically, what is the most hopeful place in the Jewish world, I would mention something that Daniel spoke about, and that would be the Pardes Bet Midrash. When I walk into the Pardes Bet Midrash, and I see different...
You don't even have to say that anymore.
You'll hear in a moment. When I walk in, see different people, different ages, exactly what Daniel said, what he said. When I see people learning together, it gives me great hope for the Jewish future. And so why is it, nevertheless, that after 16 years of teaching here, I very, very sadly made the decision to do something else? And that is because while I was at Pardes, filled with so much hope, I was incredibly aware that for every Pardes student who is here, there were 10 or 22 or 100 who were probably leaving the Jewish world, not out of anger and not out of rebellion, but probably because of apathy or lack of knowledge. And the last few years that I was here, partly because of the Torah I was learning here, I became very attracted at the idea of working with people earlier on in the Jewish journey, people who are not yet at Pardes, or people who may never come to Pardes. And that's when the job came up of working with emergent Jewish communities in Europe, particularly on their Jewish content. It was very, very attractive to me. And I'd like to share a little bit of my impressions after a year. I'm by no means an expert, and I've done very little. All I've really done is spend the year learning. Europe's a big place. The countries that I know best are Hungary, Poland, and Germany. Sometimes when I say it, I feel a little bit about the university that had a lot of budget cuts. So they had to, the language department, they had to put the Hebrew department and the Arabic department, the Russian department, the Yiddish department, all into one department, and they called it the Department of Semitic and Anti-Semitic Languages. What I'd like to share with you today in the few minutes that I have is how Europe is much, much more than the repository of anti-Semitism, and how there are things going on in Europe that those of us in Israel and those of us in America can learn from as well. So I'm just going to give you a few little vignettes. Some people, you have heard some of them, little stories of things that have happened. One of the first times I went to a conference in Europe, I had to go to a meeting of Sarvash, which is a camp in Hungary, where people come from all over Europe to be in good Jewish space, safe Jewish space, and to learn and to gain. I see people smiling who've probably been there. Anyway, I was late, and they told me to go up to the 3rd floor. There was no sign of a meeting going on, but I walked into the room and I saw a big, on the note on the whiteboard, it said, Protocols of the Elders of Zion. So I said, either somebody forgot to rub out the board, or I'm really in the wrong meeting. Anyway, as I said, Sarvash is a camp in Hungary, which post-communism took people who had very, very little knowledge of Judaism, some who didn't even know they were Jewish, and gave them a 2-week experience in which they learnt, benched, ate, did all different beautiful Jewish things together with other Jewish people. And the unit heads are the people who really run the show. These people are simply amazing. Most of them come from very little Jewish background. When I say nothing, it is less than anything that you and I can ever imagine as nothing. The mere fact that they say they're Jewish usually puts them streets ahead of how they were brought up. And these people could assimilate so easily. They are assimilated. I mean, they're so much part of the cultures they are. Anyway, they came in, they sat down, they looked like regular European people, perfect English, most of them, by the way. Even that in and of itself is amazing. Perfect English. And I looked around, and I said to myself, the 2 wickedest ideologies of the 20th century, communism and Nazism, set themselves up that this meeting will not take place. Their raison d'etre, certainly of Nazism, was that this meeting would not take place. And they won, because these people have little content, and there are far fewer of them than there should be. But they didn't win, because the meeting took place, and they are incredible, incredible, wonderful people. So if anything can give me hope about the Jewish future, it's sitting in Moldova, in Kishinev, discussing Jewish identity with people of almost no background who love their Jewish identity. A second story is very different. Many people who know me will know that I walk around very often with my Yankees cap. I don't even know which sport it is, by the way. But I like it, it's blue, it's simple, it's quite elegant, I think, if you have to wear a cap. Anyway, I was in Riga, I think. I was in Riga, somebody at a Jewish event, and somebody came up to me and said, "Oh, I've got a Yankees kippah." They pull out the Yankees kippah from their pocket, and I said to them, "Well, that's very nice. Where did you get it from?" They said, "I got it from New York." I said, "Oh, that's very nice." And they said, "But you should know it's authentic." I said, "I'm sure it's authentic." And I said, "But what do you mean?" They said, "I didn't buy it from a kippah shop." They said, "I found it on the New York subway." He said, "This was worn by a real live Jewish American with dirty hair." So on the one hand, it's a cute story. On the other hand, when people are able to play with ritual, when people are able to play with Jewish identity, to my mind, that is not the strongest. The strongest is learning pages of Talmud and creating and doing Tikkun Olam. But second to that, one of the strongest markers of healthy Judaism is when people are able to play with their rituals, when they're able to bring the light, the delicate, into what they're doing. And I know that for many of us, we think of Europe as a place of anti-Semitism, and I'll talk about that later. But the fact of the matter is there's a revival going on. Alternative minyanim and regular old-fashioned boring minyanim. There are new, they're all great, they're all good. There are people doing interesting things. There are Gentiles interested in Judaism. There are Jews interested in Judaism. There's a freshness, simply because people were brought up with nothing. Very little, I should stop saying nothing, because people were brought up with very little. In the countries I'm in, they very, very often feel whatever they do, I do with pride and with joy. One of the greatest things I found in Sarvash is that there's nothing forcing the kids to do anything. They love doing everything that they're doing. Nevertheless, there are moments of despair. Obviously, when one looks to the future, one's not sure what the future might bring. The world is a very fragile place at the moment, I think, everywhere. But I think particularly in Europe, with its blood-soaked history, very, very often it's hard to know what's going to be in 10 years' time, what's going to be in 50 years' time. Similarly, there's no way of escaping the past in Europe. Look, I can't speak for everybody. I can just speak for some of the people I know. On the one hand, people do not wake up in the morning thinking about the Shoah. People live lives the same as they do everywhere else, and they live Jewish lives the same as everywhere else. But it's always, always there. We went to I was recently in Hungary, and we went to a town to learn about its Jewish background, and the bus stopped, and there was a train. You know, a train, not a real train, painted like, and like an old train. And I immediately assumed that it was a train that had taken Jews from this town to concentration camps. In fact, it was a train, an old train that had been turned into a restaurant. That's all it was. And everybody in the bus was laughing at me, and they said, "Now you've become a European Jew. You see a train and you assume that somebody's going to a concentration camp on it." But there's no way of escaping it. It's part of one's everyday life there, and it's always there. And that can be very despair, because it's very, very hard to build when you have that as a basis. But there's also another despair. There's also another despair. And that is, I despair of people, those not in Europe, who just see Europe as a graveyard, as a place to go. We learn a little bit about what was Europe, and then we'll go away and go back to our lives wherever they are. The fact of the matter is, incredible things are happening. Miraculous things are happening. I don't think anybody ever believed that the communities would be thriving the way that they are. And I think it would be very important for us who don't live there to really come to a more sophisticated understanding of what's going on. It doesn't always fit. What's going on in Europe doesn't always fit into our way of looking at the world, but it's happening nonetheless. And the text I thought of bringing, Leon suggested maybe bringing a text, is from Megillah, where it says, Beit HaKnesset Shecharav, a synagogue that has been destroyed, Ein Mafsidim B'tocho. We don't do eulogies within it. Now I'm going to give a real meaning and a drashic meaning. The real meaning is that eulogies are everyday events. In the times of the Mishnah, they were not done in buildings, but on the street. And I was saying, don't do an everyday thing in a destroyed shul, because even if the shul has been destroyed, it still has holiness. And that's one lesson I think I'd like to start off with. Even if a place has been destroyed, and I don't think it only applies in Europe, even if we think something is finished or gone, it still has a special sanctity to it. The fact that something of great value happened there, I think, is of tremendous significance. But now I'd like to give a drashic explanation. And as I said, I don't think it really, this is what it really means. Beit HaKnesset Shecharav, Ein Mafsidim B'tocho, a shul that has been destroyed, don't be too quick to make a eulogy on it, because you never ever know what's going to happen. You never ever know that Beit Knesset can be rebuilt, and it might be rebuilt in even a better and a greater way than it was before. Leon said before maybe to speak about it more broadly. On the one hand, I don't want to get into a rally of like, don't give up, don't give up, don't give up. But I think we would be foolish in the Jewish world to make eulogies too quickly. Our history is too much a history of rise and fall, and rise and rise and rise again. And I think if there was one general lesson to learn from Europe, is to allow ourselves to be surprised and not to think that Jewish history ends at a point, even at a terrible point, like what happened in Europe, but that as Jewish people, our power of reinvention and recreation, that is truly the miracle of what Judaism is.
I want to throw out two questions, but don't feel restricted to them by way of brief responses to what you heard in the others, and then we'll open it up for everyone to have questions. I sense, and maybe it's because of the subject material, some kind of divide, I think, on these questions, maybe between you, David, and between the two of you, Chama and Daniel. The quote that's often attributed to Martin Luther King, but it was actually a minister named Theodore Parker, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Does that seem true to the particular frames that each of you is looking at when we think about the arc of religious life, or the arc of Jewish religious life, or the arc of politics, and particularly our politics here? I want to allow you, David, to sort of address this in your own way. Does it bend toward justice? Does it bend toward hope? Do you see some kind of an arc when you look at the large frame here? And secondly, do we have enough in common to move toward reconciliation? That was a phraseology that you used, Nakama. I'm thinking about in all these different spheres, in intra-Jewish fighting, in struggles between Judaism and Islam, or Jews and Arabs, between liberals and conservatives, and in your context, between the far-flung parts of the diaspora. Do we have enough in common to move toward reconciliation? So whoever wants to jump in first with either of these, or with something that these questions have sparked for you as a way of responding to our other panelists.
You've been volunteering.
So first, Nechama and I share an office, and we were talking a few minutes right before the panel. We were talking about like long-term optimism about women and religion, and I shared that over a few months ago I was at a conference of religion and peace building in Washington. I had a chance to actually get to learn Chavruta with a mullah from Pakistan, and we started talking and compared my yeshiva experience to his madrasa experience, and then he says to me, about 10 years ago we had a real debate in the madrasa and about women, and we decided we were going to open up an advanced learning institution for women who wouldn't be in the same building, in a separate building, but they are learning the exact same thing we're teaching the men, and they come out with the title of Sheikha, as opposed to Sheikh. So I said, seriously, you actually beat us to that? I cannot believe it. And you know, and this past year was
what part of us?
the Seder, but I'm saying in our conversation, us of apropos what she was saying about the titles. I'm not saying it's everywhere in the Muslim world, but I thought that that was interesting, and also the fact that there was the first Qadit, first woman Qadi, and where Israel's not the first. It's already happened in Jordan, in Egypt. So I'm optimistic. I don't know if you are, but in my regarding that, I'm bend towards justice, bend towards hope. I'm a determined optimist, and I really do believe that even when things get really a sense of despair, I believe that creativity breeds, that crisis breeds creativity, and that when things get really, really dark and feel like there's no hope, that's when people start getting creative and thinking of new initiatives. So many fantastic initiatives have been born from the darkest moments, and that gives me hope both in terms of what's going on in American politics. I see a lot of great organizations now rolling up their sleeves and saying, how do we get to work, including this one, and in terms of what's going on in the conflicts here in our own country. So, cautiously but determined optimist.
So I'm gonna put, say less optimistic maybe, because I think, when you talk about morality leading to justice, is that more or less, I'm paraphrasing, okay? The question is, who defines what justice is? And I often get asked, oh, what does the halakha say? That's everyone's big question. Oh, is it okay? What does the halakha say? And, after 30 years of learning, I'm less angry than I was before I began to educate myself. But I'm more frustrated in many ways. And part of what I'm frustrated about is how simplistically we present concepts and constructs like halakha, like justice, as if there's, and I'm using halakha and justice because halakha is our legal, essentially is our justice arm, meaning essentially it's where we create law and where we adjudicate. And it depends who you ask. There's no uniform answer to that, of what justice looks like or what legal systems should look like. And that to me is at times deeply frustrating. On the other hand, very inspiring. I mean, lack of uniformity means no one congregation or community or rabbi controls the conversation. But it does mean there is often a lack of uniformity and then a lot of fear that people will be not just disregarded but invalidated for unpopular positions that are more just and more moral. And I often say to Alex Israel, we've had this conversation many times, when my morality and my Torah are like this, that's a deeply painful moment when I can't reconcile those two. And so I've had too many moments like that in the last few years. On the other hand, I am hopeful because I think Judaism and Halachic Judaism have vibrancy and fluidity and movement, and so that is hopeful.
I don't think I agree with the statement that the world bends to justice. I think we don't want to get into theodicy too much in this panel, but we know too many examples of where things do not work out the way that they should or we would like them to. That's why many of us believe in Olam Haba or Mashiach or whatever the case might be. Tchiat HaMetim. But I think as people, as human beings, and also as Jews, there's always the question of, do I want to be right or do I want to be effective? So while I don't believe that the world bends to justice, I think that as people and as Jews, we have the ability to carry on, move on, get on with things, do things, recreate. And if that's some type of a justice, so be it. The justice of not allowing the injustice to put one down, but to be able to grow, then perhaps, that's what I would hope for. And my answer is similar to the question about reconciliation. I'm not convinced I really want reconciliation. I think it's nice to have lots of different people thinking different things, including people doing and saying things that I disbelieve in. But I think the real challenge is, how do we learn to manage those points where what I believe and think and do impinges on what you believe and think and do. And Michael Goodman has written this book that's very popular at the moment about the Arab-Israeli conflict, where he says we should give up trying to solve it or win it, but rather to manage it. And I think that that's probably a good idea intra-Jewishly, as well as nice we just add on a panel. It's very easy to say, it's very hard to do, but I think we need to have our sights a little bit lower. And what can we do where things do affect each other to somehow manage or to lower the level of acrimony, and to find some. They have this concept in science and also in anthropology of muddling along, and to find some way to muddle along with these different issues.
Thank you. Let's take a couple of questions from all of you. Any of you?
Never happened.
My question is for Daniel. And at the risk of anything political is politically charged and tends to blow things up and whatever, my point here is actually in the spirit of what it is that you do as far as engaging in perhaps sometimes very difficult dialogues. Your story of you reached out to your colleague in light of all the celebrations that we've made and terrorists who committed such heinous crimes and whatnot. It kind of struck a chord with me in the sense that his response was, I guess, first and foremost empathy, but it was followed up by, oh, well, look at what's going on with us. And I understand that he said he didn't want to make a moral equivalency. My question is this: I do not know of any Jews, okay, whether publicly or otherwise, that were out celebrating massacres of people. Okay, I don't know. If it happened, I don't know. And when such a thing happens, and when you're talking about on such a large scale, not just a handful, a bunch of individuals, there didn't seem to be a gun held to their head. How do you have such discussions, dialogues? Essentially, how do you have a dialogue with somebody that essentially wants to kill you? That essentially, from that behavior, at least it appears so. It's very hard, and especially when they, instead of true empathy, they'll kind of bring back examples. Well, this is what happened to us.
Let's take a couple more questions and then we'll open it up.
Yes, can you just...
Well, I never just question, I admit, but I just want to respond.
No, I'm sorry, I do want to keep it to questions. Just...
And then I have to say the most important thing that Daniel said is we should be reading the news the way we read text. That's the only thing I want to emphasize. We have to read the news because the news that we read is one side and there's other news that we don't read.
Thank you. Thank you.
You all spoke very eloquently, but it struck me from a fairly top-down institutional angle. And I'm really interested in the particular mechanic whereby institutions, perhaps particularly Jewish institutions, push very heavy stones up very big hills of masses of people. And it particularly struck, I come from this graveyard of anti-Semitism and whatever, and I would just be very interested in if any of you have an angle on how that mechanic of organizations and individuals might be changing, how that might relate to hope, despair, and so on. Thank you.
Let's take one more. Thank you.
There was a point that Nechama mentioned about you were in, I think you were in Beit HaKerem, and people were starting to bash Haredim, and the Haredim did not show up. And that seems to be a pattern from my experience also. I have the same problem, trying very hard to hold on to V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha and not descend into hatred. And I'm asking for help.
So, in response to Ben, your comment, yeah, absolutely. Both he and I were not saying there's any moral equivalence. The question is, what's occupying, our news consumption? That was actually my point. And it's troubling that, that people have no idea of any kind of shared story. The difference between learning text and consuming news is that when we learn a text, full disclosure, Ben and I were chavruta 25 years ago. We learned text together. We each had the common Gemara in front of us, and then we'd be looking at different commentaries. But imagine if I only read one commentary, and you only read the other commentary, and we never read the original Gemara. The ability for us to have any kind of discussion is extremely minimalized. Or if I only read, Rashi, and you read the Rashbam and the Chumash, but we never read the story. We would think our commentary is the fact. That's what's challenging us through social media, that's what's challenging us through the news, and we have to reconstruct what's the common story with its ambiguities that we're then diverging into different narratives and identity groups.
I just want to push you on this.
Is there a common story across all of these various divides that we're talking about?
The common story, of course, is that we, in any type of conflict situation, if you dig deep enough, if you can go back to where are the shared facts, okay? And I don't have time to give it an example of what happened on the Temple Mount. But if you go back to what is the shared facts, and then where do things diverge from there? What is being emphasized? What's not being emphasized? I'm not saying it's so easy. I'm saying without doing that, any kind of conversation is impossible because we're living in two totally different worlds. That's what's in my mind is tearing apart America. That people think they have more communication, they actually are communicating less. And they have less knowledge of even what's going on. I flip back and forth all the time between Fox and CNN. And at home for Shabbat, my kids read Makor Rishon and Haaretz in order to get used to reading the way they read the Gemara, with one commentary on the right, one commentary on the left. And I think so, as a place of hopefulness, I think that a lot of these conflicts that we're facing with today are identity conflicts. They're not just scarcity of resource conflicts. To the extent that we can expand our identities, be curious about the identities, the stories, the meaning systems of others, there's a chance to transform them. If we can't, we don't have that opportunity.
Okay, so what's your name? Anthony? Anthony. How organizations push the heavy boulders up the mountain, so to speak. Look, I teach in a number of organizations, educational institutions, and I think that question of how to disseminate your message is something that shifts and changes all the time. I know that I teach 18-year-olds in a gap year program, and I know that every year we rethink how we're going to do the work that we do, and I think effective organizations, and I'm sure my colleagues would agree, is that there's no you're talking about top-down. The top-down has to constantly be aware of the bottom-up, and if you don't create that kind of dialogue or that kind of understanding of who you're reaching down to and who's reaching up to you, and I really like to think of it as a constant flow, right? When I talk about halachic change, sometimes it's bottom-up and sometimes it's top-down, right? And so the two have to be aware of each other. I think to be most effective, they're really, and especially today, and especially with the way young people are constantly changing the way in which they're educated, effective organizations and institutions have to think carefully about who they're reaching out to and how to get their message across. And I don't know if that's what you're looking for, but I think that the stone doesn't get any lighter. It's just a question of whether you fling it across the internet or whether you sit in a baby drash and try to get people to come and open the books. Meaning that they're just different models. So I'm happy you can clarify it maybe for my colleagues if you want a different answer. Your question is a very difficult one. The question of what do we do when the person sitting across from us, in theory belongs to the same broader camp, but is so different that I can't even, it's as if we're talking two different conversations. So I'm going to tell two little stories. I have 4 daughters. Just the reward for a Jewish feminist, right? Having to raise 4 daughters, and God has a great sense of humor. My daughter, after hearing the guy, she came to the Dai group. She's 22. She's in Hebrew University, and she said, "You know what? She went to volunteer in Ghana after the army, like every good Israeli, and she went with the Jewish agency with 10. And she said, for the first 2 months, she would get into a Ghana cab, and she would ask the Ghana cab driver, do you know where such and such place is? And they always said yes, and they always spent about a half an hour driving around until you realized that they had no idea where they were going. And she said, you know, when they got there, everyone was very excited because in Ghana they speak English. So, oh, we can all communicate, right? We'd sit down and have a conversation. But she began to realize that they actually don't have the word no in their vocabulary, and that you have to listen to their body language, right? Through their body language, you can actually see if the answer is yes or no, not through language. And, you know, she went over to Shelby and told her this story. She said, at the end of the day, we often think we speak the same language. I'm saying this about Haredim as well. We tend to think because we're committed to Torah and mitzvot and halakha, and we have a belief in God, a similar belief system, that we're going to be able to have a conversation. And so we start talking, but we're really not talking the same language. I'm not giving you a great concrete answer. I'm just saying I think it's very complex when we sit with people who we think we should be able to relate to and we don't. And then I think that brings me to the top-down, bottom-up. We have to learn then how to speak so we can listen. And I'll just use a second example, a different story with my youngest daughter, who's 12. I started going to Israeli-Palestinian dialogue groups, a dialogue group particularly for women, largely because of Pardes and because of my students in Pardes, and I just felt it was unconscionable that
Not a good thing.
Not a good thing. Thank you, Dave. To not begin humanizing and having a name and a face on other. And I came back from the last meeting last week where we sat down and had a meal together. I koshered a pot, and then they made this grape leaf dish that was absolutely unbelievable. And we sat down and we ate. And I brought some of it home. My daughter's a cook, so I thought you would enjoy eating something that I could never make. And she said, I'm not going to eat that. Palestinians made it. And I thought, wow. Now you have a moment as a parent, by the way, where you have to think of how to respond, or all those sitting here nodding. You can yell at the child and shame them and say, I can't believe you just said that, how did I raise you? Or you can wait, walk out of the room and come back and start talking a little bit what she's experiencing and where she's getting this from, and try to turn it into an educational moment, which I have to say, I don't always succeed. This time I did. And she came down and she ate the food. You know, she sat and she ate the food, and we talked about the women that I sit with, and I tried to give them names and faces. And it was a very intense moment. I will say it was in the wake of Chalamish, which you didn't mention, but the massacre in Chalamish, which obviously for a 12-year-old was an extremely terrifying event. She's been sleeping in our room for the last week and a half, which has made my husband unhappy, but okay, understandable. And so I think, you know, this idea of humanizing people that we're afraid of, or we don't relate to, is a little drops in the bucket that add up. And I'll just make one more point. I'm involved a lot in religious LGBT conversation, and both as in Beit Hillel and out. There is a unbelievable difference between people who actually know gays, gay LGBT students, family members, and so on, and those who don't know anyone personally. And I think the same could be said, you know, drop by drop, often, you know, relating to Haredim as individuals, as opposed to this uniform group that we often protest or disagree with, is one tiny way to start. I met a group of Haredi men at Limud Tel Aviv, which was really crazy. I walk in and there are all these Haredi men. And we ended up sitting down and I told them what I did, and they listened. They were astonished. I was astonished that they were listening to me. And it turns out they're a group of Haredim who are doing secular Haredi dialogue in Tel Aviv. What's it called? Yes. Now again, you can say, oh, is that changing anything? There are these masses of people who are constantly protesting and fighting us. But you could say the same thing about the Israeli-Palestinian dialogue groups that go on. Is that going to change? You have to start somewhere. And so sometimes finding a space that's positive allows you then to deal with all of the negative energy that comes when we disagree. So that, perhaps as a suggestion, thinking in that direction.
I'm going to try very hard. I'm not going to repeat anything that other people have said. I'll just say two small things about building communities. One is I'm not very old. I think I'm 26. I very much believe that I'm 26.
I'm 21, so
okay. But first of all, the sea change I've seen in my lifetime and some of the issues we've spoken about is incredible, the issues that we haven't spoken about. So I just want to point that out, that there have been sea changes on certain issues. The way to build communities, one is exactly the same way one eats an elephant. You know how you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. You do small things, they become bigger things. When the JDC went into Europe after the fall of communism, they were worried about giving people bread and blankets and place to live and to help them in the new economic framework. They brought a few people to sing Hava Nagila with them, and that Hava Nagila grew into the renewal that we're seeing today. So you do things one bite at a time. When a student couldn't find a yeshiva in Israel in the early 1970s, and yes, Leon, I'm not paid to do this anymore. When a student in the early 1970s couldn't find a yeshiva and decided to start his own, that's how Pardes came into about. The last thing I'd like to leave with, though, I think this is important in terms of communities. This is something that I've learned during this year, but I've also read, everybody wants to come up with the great, new, best idea. I've got the most brilliant idea in the world. This is going to change everything. And a lot of thinking in the Jewish world, but also outside the Jewish world at the moment, is that there are no really great Jewish, fantastic Jewish ideas that are changing the world. What we mostly do is we tweak and we change ideas that are already there. We bring two different ideas that we didn't necessarily think were connected to each other, and we bring them together in some way. And I think what sometimes happens is we're too much after, the next brilliant idea, I'm going to, get the grant and create the app, and that will change the Jewish world. Slowly, surely is the way we've always done it, and I think it's the way that works.
The very end of the Agadah that we spoke about by way of introducing this panel, and the very last words of Masechet Makot are Nichamtanu Akiva Nichamtanu. You have consoled us, Akiva, by your laughing, by your seeing this redemptive, hopeful side to the most challenging events. So I just want to say, by way of conclusion, Nichamtanu, from our panelists, from their words and their work, you've given us on this day a greater sense of hope. And I want to thank you, Nechama, Daniel, David, and thanks to all of you for joining us.